why the weather is terrible, and really it's not possible to guess whether it's winter, whether it's autumn, what season it really is. But definitely it's a day when we have the privilege to host a discussion with Ambassador Ivo Daalder, who is US Ambassador to NATO, here with us. And I'm also happy to say that this is the first discussion for the discussion round we will be having every month here with LATO, with many kind of diverse experts. And I promise also the next discussion, I will keep it in a secret still, will be announced for the January, with also high-level experts on foreign policy and security. We are a little bit late, so I will not waste so much time, as we have really brilliant speakers. We are really looking forward to here today. So I will give the floor to Ambassador Daalder. And this is a great opportunity for the youngsters, for the younger generation, to prepare the questions and ask directly to one of the highest ranking diplomats in the world. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thanks. Appreciate both the opportunity to speak to all of you, and in fact for your introduction. I've never heard myself referred to as one of the highest ranking diplomats in the world. But I'm fine with it. Got no problem. But that actually may be a good way for me to start, and because I didn't start out as a diplomat, high ranking or not. In fact, I'm not a diplomat. I'm an academic. That's what I do. I spent my life, the last 30 years in one way or another, being a student. In fact, I was a student for 12 years, to do my various degrees, and then teaching students, and then working with students. So that's what I really do. And then once in a while, when the right kind of political party wins an election, they roll me out of the academic world and put me in some place like the White House in the mid-1990s, and now at NATO, in this unique American system where you can go what we call in and out of government. There's a revolving door among lobbyists, but there's also a revolving door from people who do policy to people who do policy analysis. So I'm one of those people, and after this I'll go back and be a lowly ranked academic as opposed to the highly ranked diplomat. So it's a great opportunity to spend time with all of you today, and I'll say a few things, a few words, but I really want to give you an opportunity to not only ask me questions, but say what's on your mind, and see if we can have it just a good conversation, because that's really what I think is most important. You know, if I were the same age, you know, look, when I was the same age as some of you who were students, I grew up in the end of the Cold War, and my academic career was about the Cold War. In fact, I wrote my PhD dissertation on NATO nuclear weapons, and from the moment it was finished to the moment it was defended, it turned in from a policy analysis into a history. Because my policy analysis was all about how we should modernize NATO nuclear weapons, and it was finished in 1989. And then when I defended it a few months later, it was a brilliant history that nobody's ever read, which is true with most academic worlds, brilliant and unread. I learned over time that it's probably better to write not very brilliant things that people do read, so I now tweet. It's just a lot easier for people to figure out what you're saying. That was my formative period. It was at the end of the Cold War, when it was clear that there was something wrong with the Soviet Union, but it wasn't really clear what was wrong with the Soviet Union. There was a problem with the Western world, which really didn't know where it wanted to go in the late 70s and the 80s. There was a time of malaise, but it was a very well understood time frame, and it was easy to do the kind of analysis that one did in the academic world at the time. If I look at today, it's just completely different. Just the world is not only different because the Cold War ended. The world's just different. fundamental ways. And I used to call this one, before I became a diplomat, the era of global politics. We live in a place where geography is no longer the determinant factor in international relations. But globalization, the forces of technology, the forces of communications, the democratization of technology, of warfare. You know, few guys can now kill thousands, tens of thousands of people in a way that wasn't possible 20, 30, 40 years ago. But now it is possible. And that's the world, a world of rapid communication, a world of rapid interaction in which people move left and right without regard to boundaries. I flew all the way from Brussels here, and I never went through any customs. That's unheard of even 25 years ago, but today it's just normal. That's how we move. And we may think we're Latvians one day, but then we start working in Brussels, or we go to the United States, and then we're Americans the next, and Belgians or Europeans the day after. You may not know this, but I was actually born and raised in the Netherlands. I speak fluent Dutch. My father still lives there, but I am now an American diplomat. And that's the world we live in. We can move back and forth in various different ways. So the question really is, if that's the world we live in, what does an organization like NATO, that was founded fundamentally to deal with a rising, believed to be a rising threat from the east to the territory in Western Europe, what does that organization do? How does it manage the reality of a world of globalization in the 21st century? And the answer to that is fundamentally twofold. One is because the world is changing so rapidly, the only way we can deal with that change is to work together. And one of the understandings that the Obama administration came to office with was that if we are going to deal with the threats and challenges that we have, whether it's proliferation or cyber threats or terrorism or what have you, we need to have partners. We need to work with other countries. Even a country as strong as the United States is not able to deal with the challenges all by itself. So we need partners. And the most logical partners to look at were our alliances. And in fact, the most important alliance we had was the one that we had with Europe. People who shared our values in many ways, lots of our history, an economic interaction that we had that was unmatched anywhere else in the world, and military and political diplomatic power that was together unmatched anywhere in the world. So we had to rebuild our partnerships with Europe. And indeed, I was nominated as the third. There were three ambassadors were nominated by the president as the first ambassadors. One to Afghanistan, the other one to Iraq. We had 200,000 people in those countries fighting a war, and the third one was to NATO. Plus, of course, our ambassador to the UN, who was a cabinet member. Making clear that we wanted international institutions and organizations to be at the center of our foreign policy. So we look at NATO as an instrument for dealing with the challenges that are out there in the world. When we look at cyber defense, we look at how do we control, how do we work together to make sure that our computer systems are safer and more secure. If we look at proliferation of ballistic missiles, we're developing missile defense systems that are together with our allies here in Europe to provide the protection and defense for NATO Europe, as well as for other parts of the world, including the United States. So partnerships and working together is fundamental to what we do. But the second reason why we want to, reason why NATO is sort of critical to the world that we live in, is that just as the United States needed partners to deal with the threats and challenges and opportunities that are out there, so NATO needs partners and to work with the threats and challenges and opportunities out there. And one way to look at NATO is that NATO is an important organization for collective defense of its members, which is ultimately why we're here on day 1 and day 2 and day 3. But once we have made sure that our territories and populations are secure, NATO is also ultimately an instrument, a hub for building security more broadly. And it's only through building security in the regions outside of the transatlantic relationship that we will be secure inside the transatlantic relationship. It's that interaction in a world of globalization between what's out there and what's at home that is so important to find ways to deal with it. So we have a strong partnership, for example, with Russia, because our security depends in some important ways on the security of our neighbors. If our neighbors are secure, we will be secure. And indeed, if more and more of the international system is secure, we are more likely to be able to be secure ourselves. So NATO is a hub of security relationships. We saw in the Libya campaign that we have now relationships with countries in the Arab world. We have the UAE and Qatar and Morocco and Jordan not only be participants in an operation in North Africa, but actually be part of demanding NATO be part of a solution. We have in Afghanistan 22 countries that are now part of a operation together with the 28 countries in NATO in order to build security in Afghanistan. Not because we want this beautiful country to know no war anymore, of course we do. Not because the people of Afghanistan need to be supported, which of course they do, but because our security depends on it. It's the insecurity in Afghanistan that created a threat to the United States and that led NATO to act for the first time to invoke Article 5 and to act accordingly. So we're in Afghanistan fundamentally because security in Afghanistan is important for security at home. And that's why more and more countries are now cooperating in that effort and working together. And in that effort, we have not just European countries and NATO members, but we have countries from as far away as New Zealand and El Salvador and Japan and Australia cooperating in Afghanistan. They have come to look to NATO as a means for working together to promote security. So that's NATO in the 21st century. It still is about collective defense. It still is about making sure that the members of NATO are secure against the threats that we face, whether they are from near or far. But it is also about building security, cooperatively working together with other countries so that the neighborhood is secure, and beyond the neighborhood we are all secure, and as a result, security is written at home is as important as abroad. That's how NATO is evolving. And if we look at the decisions we made in Lisbon, where we had at the last summit in November 2010, where we adopted a new strategic concept, much of this concept of a collective defense and cooperative security working together was adopted there. What we're looking for in Chicago is to give life to that by saying, how do our partnerships, how can they be evolve in a way that makes countries want to cooperate with NATO more than they may have in the past? How do we ensure that we have the right capabilities to deal with the threats that we face? So we have missile defense capabilities that are capable of dealing with the threat from missile proliferation in the Middle East. And how do we make sure that if we need to use military force, as all of a sudden we decided we did in the case of Libya, that we have the right capabilities to work together and cooperate in order to deal with the challenges that we face, not only among the 28 nations, but also the partner nations around it. So that's how I see NATO today. It's different than the one when I grew up, but it's still very relevant to your generation. And I would argue it is as relevant to your generation in a different way, but still as relevant as it is to my generation and my parents' generation, who grew up with a NATO that was about the Cold War, about two blocks, about deterrence and concentration on defending borders. Now our borders are no longer as defensible as they were because they are permeable. That is one of the great strengths of the world we live in, because we can move around. It's also one of our vulnerabilities. And therefore, because of that's the case, we need to work together to make sure that whatever threats are out there don't undermine our security at home. So with that, let me turn it back to you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or hear your thoughts.
Do we have any questions from the young generation that is living now in today's world? So, there's one.
Hi, my name is Chukura, and I am a student of Davis University. And my question to you would be, how would you comment the NATO-Russia relationship regarding missile defense shield, since you know, the rhetoric in Lisbon summit was very warm and hopeful, but right now it looks like a dead end?
Well, it's a very important question, and as you said, when at Lisbon, we made two fundamental decisions as NATO. First and most important, we made the decision that we needed missile defenses to defend against the threat of proliferation of missiles, which is growing. 30 countries have acquired ballistic missiles. Many of the countries in the Middle East are acquiring ballistic missiles of ever longer ranges. And we collectively decided that the best response to that was not only to work diplomatically to reduce the threat, but most importantly to build a missile defense system that was capable to offer protection for NATO's territory, populations, and forces. That was the first decision. Second decision was we would be better off if we cooperated with Russia in addressing that threat, both to reduce the threat and also to build missile defense systems that were complementary so that we could use each other's capabilities to enhance the defense of both of Russia and of NATO. President Medvedev at the time said he was interested in missile defense cooperation. He had his own ideas. Those ideas weren't exactly the same as ours, but we agreed that we would spend time talking about how we could cooperate. And we've been doing that for the last year or so. And in that year, it has become clear that we have slightly different conceptions of how to cooperate. Russia would like to cooperate in a way in which Russia would have a joint control over missile defenses. We have said, well, I'm sorry, but NATO has to defend NATO. Russia can defend Russia, but NATO has to defend NATO. But we would be better off if NATO and the Russia system work together and cooperate. And we're trying to figure out how to do that. And we have put a number of proposals on the table about how we could actually actively cooperate together. The Russians have said, well, we're interested in those proposals. But before we go any further, we need to be absolutely certain that what you deploy in Europe is not a threat to our systems. So we have spent a lot of time talking to them about that. We have taken a number of Russian officials to American facilities. We've showed what it is that we're trying to do and what kind of capabilities we have. We have made very clear that this is not about Russia. This is not directed against Russia. The systems we're deploying are not capable of posing a threat to the Russian strategic deterrent. These systems are directed at threats from outside of Europe, from the Middle East, not against Russia. And we're still in a conversation. The latest, as you know, is that this President Medvedev, after he met with President Obama in Hawaii, said that he was continue to be interested in having a discussion with NATO about how we can cooperate, but that he needed real guarantees that our system was not directed against Russia. And we are ready to discuss what those guarantees would entail in terms of whatever written commitments they need. We will put on paper, this is not about Russia. We will put on paper, this is not directed against Russia. We will put on paper, this system is not capable of undermining Russia's strategic deterrent. We're willing to put all of that on paper. What we're not willing to do is to agree today to limits on our capabilities, because we don't know how the world is going to change. And we're not going to have a system that has nothing to do with Russia and is not directed against Russia, somehow limited in a legal treaty when it has nothing to do with Russia. So that's where our disagreements are. So we've disagreed on more things before. We'll disagree on more things after, and we'll continue our discussion. What is clear is we will deploy our missile defenses. We're not going to let the disagreement we have with Russia stop us from deploying our missile defense. That said, we would prefer to work together with Russia, to cooperate, find ways to move forward together with it. And we're committed to having that discussion with them here, wherever they want, at any time. And indeed, those discussions continue to go on.
So, let's give the youngsters a chance to ask the questions first.
You really asked me a number of later. My question will be about Afghanistan. What's the strategy of NATO after 2014? Is it more of economic nature or more of a military?
Well, it's a very important question. First, in terms of 2014 as the date, we agreed in Lisbon that by the end of 2014, the responsibility for security should be in the hands of the Afghans. Not right now, it's being shared between the Afghans and NATO and the ISAF countries. By the end of 2014, it should be in the hands of the Afghan security forces. I think we recognized then, and we still recognize today, and the international community recognized in Bonn just a few weeks ago, that after 2014, this country, which has known 30-plus years of civil war and foreign intervention, that is one of the poorest countries in the world, will still need international assistance. It will need international economic assistance. And indeed, the international community, the 85 countries that came together in Bonn, agreed that they would provide international economic assistance, and it would need international security assistance in two ways. One, the Afghan forces that have been built up slowly but surely over the last few years will still need to be trained and advised and assisted after 2014, just as they are today. One of the things NATO is looking at is how could NATO help in that process. And the second assistance that Afghanistan will need post-2014 is somebody needs to be able to pay for sustaining that force. The budget of Afghanistan as a poor country is not sufficient to pay a large security force, police force and army force that is out there. So the international community will have to find financial assistance to supplement what the Afghans can pay themselves, to pay the salaries, to buy the equipment, to provide the training to the Afghan forces. And NATO, again, is looking at what role will it have in that part of the equation. The United States is committed to stay with some military capability after 2014. The nature of that and the size is all still to be determined. I think that most NATO countries, if not all NATO countries, share the U.S. view, and certainly that NATO should have a role after 2014 in Afghanistan to support the development of the security forces and to train and advise and assist those forces. So that will be the focus, not so much in what has been in the last 10 years, which is to build security, but in this case to provide assistance to the Afghan forces so they can maintain and build security in their own country.
So, Eddie Bosch.
Eddie Bosch, I'm a lecturer in international relations, a journalist as well. Thanks for coming tonight. The region, the countries of this region had a very intense and a high-profile relationship with the previous American administration. And when the current administration came in, there was a sort of some kind of not second thought, but lowered expectations of what the attention that the Obama administration is going to pay to this region. There was this famous letter as well in 2009, I think, basically arguing that as the Obama administration is conducting this reset policy with the Russians, that maybe the relationship with this region here may be downgraded a bit or overlooked. What is your assessment as we now approach the end of Obama administration? At least we're approaching the end of Obama's first term. We don't know yet how it will work out, right? What is your assessment of this first term? How has the relationship with this region between the United States and this region, which is so intensive, and which is a relationship that is perceived as being so important in this region here? What is your assessment of Obama's first term?
Well, I should really turn that one around and ask you what your assessment is. We never thought there was an issue. In terms of the Obama administration, we set out to rebuild our alliances, starting with NATO. We were strong supporters and have always been strong supporters of all members of NATO, and believed that our relationship with Eastern and Central Europe was strong, important, vital, and both bilaterally and regionally, but most importantly within the context of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There was a perception, I'm not never sure what it was based on, other than a very zero-sum view that if you have a relationship with Moscow that is good, it must be bad for Central and Eastern Europe. I would turn that around and say if you have good relations with Moscow, then that is also good for its neighbors. And that to the extent that the reset has worked, which is a different set of issues, but to the extent the reset has worked, it has worked not at the expense, but to the benefit of all countries in Europe. We all benefit when there are good relations between the United States and Russia, between NATO and Russia, that will help all of us, not just the United States or Russia, but indeed all countries of NATO. So that's point number one. Point number two is there was this fear that somehow the United States would, because the president had made clear that he had questions about missile defense, that somehow those questions would translate into a lesser commitment to European defense and to missile defense writ large. As it turned out, we not only weren't against missile defense, we were actually really in favor of missile defense for Europe as opposed to anything else, because the missile defense system that we are deploying, and by the way, we're deploying it now, as opposed to in 2018, which is when the previous administration was going to deploy it, is about Europe. It's about defending Europe against the threat from the Middle East. It is not, in the first instance, about defending the United States against that threat, which is what the third site was all about. So we were able to develop missile defenses that were swifter in terms of its deployment, that were smarter because they were adapting to the threat and are adapting to the threat, and that provided not only a relationship with two countries, Poland and the Czech Republic, but became a project that NATO as a whole could do. So now 28 countries have adopted missile defense as their own capability, and we're deploying that whether, while we would like to have a cooperative relationship, as I just said, with Russia on this issue, we're deploying it no matter whether we will have a cooperative relationship with Russia. So again, I can't answer the question of how people in Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia feel about the Obama administration's commitment to Eastern Europe, except that the kinds of complaints we heard in 2009, we don't hear today. We don't see them. I don't hear them where I work. The administration doesn't work. I think it was based on a perception that may have been misplaced. But over time, I think the administration has demonstrated that, like the previous administration, we care about the fundamental security of this part of the world. We are strong supporters of Baltic air policing, and we'll push in Chicago to extend Baltic air policing for a continuous period. We are strong supporters of the development of Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian and Polish defense capabilities. We are working together, as we did with Latvia, to train and bolster the capability for forces in Afghanistan. And in every other way, we are strong believers in that the security of Latvia, the security of East and Central Europe, is fundamental to the security of the United States, even if, at the same time, we try to have good and positive relationships with Moscow, because that, too, is good for security here, but it's also good for security more broadly.
Can I have a follow-up on that? Well, I basically share...
A question or a comment?
A follow-up question, actually. Well, I share all of that analysis, and I don't see, I think it has been shown over the last couple of years that there's no contradiction between the reset and the American commitment to its allies here. However, if I was Georgian, for example, my perspective might be a bit different, because obviously the previous administration, it was obviously before the Russia-Georgia war. Again, the circumstances are different. But nevertheless, I guess you could make the argument that the Obama administration has lost all of the appetite for NATO expansion, which was such a huge agenda during the previous administration, with reference to the post-Soviet space, the rest of the countries in the post-Soviet space. So basically, if I would make an argument that reset, you cannot have a reset and an active policy of further NATO enlargement into the post-Soviet space, would you also say that that is not the case? You can have both.
I certainly believe that we not only can we have both, we do have both. Which is to say, the Obama administration remains as committed to an open-door policy as every other previous American administration. Many of the people who worked in this administration actually started the process of enlargement. So in that sense, it's nothing new. Our relationship with Georgia remains the same, which is we stand by the commitment in Bucharest that Georgia will become a member of NATO. We work together very closely with Georgia to promote the reforms that are necessary for it to become a member of NATO. We stand by the absolute rejection of the occupation of Georgian territory by Russia, and we want it reversed and ended. Our disagreement, our reset with Russia has not led to any change in policy towards Georgia in that regard. At the same time, we recognize that in order for Georgia to become a member of NATO, all 28 members need to agree. That's not different than the previous administration. It's a reality. And it's a consensus organization in which membership, particularly membership of new countries, needs to be decided by everyone. We're working to create the conditions that will allow us to get to that position. We're not there yet. There isn't an agreement within NATO, let alone an agreement that Georgia is ready for the point of membership. But we're working to create conditions to when that happens, that we can get to that point. In that sense, it hasn't changed from the previous administration. And the American policy, and it is American policy rather than one administration versus the other administration, has been not only supportive of enlargement, it's been the driving force of enlargement. And that remains unchanged for the future.
So, next from the middle.
Good evening, Elizabeth, Ministry of Defense. Another question that has recently been on the NATO agenda is the decreasing or insufficient defense budgets. And the United States have called on European countries to increase the burden shared by Europe. Considering the fact that the United States now are introducing budget cuts, and also the fact that while lacking direct threats to Europe and increasing probably social turmoil in some European countries, with lack of perspective, taking all the economic crisis in perspective, is that actually a credible outcome that European countries could find the political will? And what happens if it does not happen?
Well, I mean, first, the United States has been asking Europeans to increase defense spending for the last 50 years. So, in that sense, nothing new there. There is, in the last decade, and this is something that Secretary Gates, just before he left his post, addressed in his speech in last June. In the last decade, there has been a growing gap in spending. It used to be about a decade ago that the United States accounted for 50% of total NATO defense spending. Right now, it's about 75%. So it's a huge change that has come over in the last few years. At the same time, we all recognize the economic problems that everyone is facing, including the United States, which is why we are cutting our defense spending as well. And rather than focusing specifically on the level of defense spending, although every country should increase their defense spending, and there is a NATO guideline that says we ought to spend at least 2% of our GDP on defense, a guideline that only a few countries meet. But in addition to looking at more resources, we're looking at how the resources are spent. And rather than having every country looking at what can they do internally only within their own defense capabilities and buying, that everybody buys whatever capability they need for self-defense. One of the options that NATO offers is that you can cooperate on buying equipments that you can't afford by yourself, or more importantly, by specializing in capabilities so that some will be responsible for some kinds of activities and others will be responsible for other kinds of activities. So let's take air policing as an example. A national perspective or even a regional perspective would say, given where we live in the Baltic states, we should have interceptor aircraft to deal with the protection of our airspace. And the Latvian and Estonian and Lithuanian defense budgets, procurement parts could be spent all on buying fighter aircraft, interceptors, and training pilots, and you would have no money left over to spend on anything else. If you look at NATO and say how many countries have interceptor aircraft, and could they do this job for the Baltic states, the answer is many countries have these aircraft, and yes, they could do this for the Baltic states. That's where, in 2004, the idea of Baltic air policing came from, which is that a country like the United States or France or Germany or Denmark or the United Kingdom could voluntarily provide aircraft, base them here, provide for air policing, and the money that would be normally spent on procuring F-16s or Tornadoes or Eurofighters are now being used to create a strong maneuver capability that can be used and deployed in Afghanistan or indeed to defend Latvian territory here at home. That's another way in which you can spend resources. So take Baltic air policing and say that's the way we need to think about defense spending within NATO writ large. And when we look at Chicago, we're looking at a whole series of initiatives that would take this concept and make it the concept that applies across the board or across many different ways. We call it smart defense, missile defense. For a very small investment, relatively speaking, a few $100 million, we are building a command and control system at NATO in which individual countries can plug in their radars, their interceptors, their ships that have radars on them, and run all those different pieces, and all of a sudden have a missile defense system that is far more capable than if you bought your own nationally. That's even true for the United States. Strategic airlift. 12 countries, including 2 non-NATO member countries, have bought 3 C-17s. And not one of those countries, except for the United States, could have bought those big aircraft that could move tons of equipment from one place to another place by themselves. But because 12 countries bought them together, they were able to afford and have have a strategic airlift capability. And that's how we're looking at it. Rather than looking at your defense spending nationally and say, what do we need nationally? Look at it in the totality of your neighbors and within the alliance of what you need to do within the alliance. The Danes have decided that they are going to invest in deployable forces, and they're no longer going to have submarines. They figured we're never going to be in a war without the Norwegians and the Dutch and the UK be part of a naval war campaign, and they have submarines. So why should we have submarines? Instead, let's take the money that we spend on submarines and invest it in deployable Army capabilities. So yes, we need to spend more. At the same time, we need to spend smarter. And the more we spend together, the more we can get out of the individual dollar or euro or whatever it is that we spend in terms of defense capability. And that's what NATO allows you to do. It allows you to spend together smarter, even if it isn't necessarily spending more. Though, let me repeat, we should spend more.
So next one. Well, there is Joris is waiting for a pretty long time.
Thank you. I'd like to turn back on the first question of defense. You said you're negotiating with Russia, and but you might have to negotiate a long time, and who knows how long it will go, or principally forever. What is your assessment? Threats are growing. There is a time limit. Time running out. What is assessment? How much long we might wait for the system employed?
We're not waiting.
1 to 3 years.
No, we're not waiting.
Sorry.
We're not waiting.
You're not waiting.
No. The time, it's now in the Eastern Mediterranean. We are deploying a radar in Turkey, which should be operational in the next few weeks. And the first phase of our national contribution to the NATO missile defense system will be operational in the next few weeks. That's according to the schedule we sent in 2009, and we're continuing to adhere to that schedule. We will, when we get to Chicago, hand over the U.S. key to NATO and say it's now a NATO key, and NATO will have an interim capability. So we are deploying our missile defense system because the threat, as you say, is growing. We need to respond to that threat. And as long as that threat exists, we are going to deploy missile defenses. At the same time, we're happy to have a dialogue with Russia to try to find ways in which we can cooperate. But the cooperation and the dialogue are not going to determine the timetable for our missile defenses. The timetable is set by what technology allows us to do to deal with the threat as it grows. And just to add, in our system, we have 4 phases. Phase 1 would be operational. It's going to be operational, as I said, in the next few weeks. Phase 2 is going to be operational in 2015 when we deploy a land-based component interceptors in Romania. Phase 3 will be operational in 2018 when we deploy a second land-based site in Poland. And Phase 4, we will enhance the capacity of the missiles, so they could of the interceptors, so they could deal with a potential ICBM threat from Iran to the United States by 2020. And that timetable is set by the threat and the evolution of technology, not by our dialogue with the Russians.
May I clarify, please?
Yep.
That means that the announcement of Mr. Medvedev, as we clarified last Friday here at a nice meeting with the Russian academia, they said this is of internal use. You are not worried about mullahs, I understand. Whatever Medvedev is saying, system would be deployed. Because we are a little bit concerned here.
No, the system will be deployed, and the fact that Mr. Medvedev has said that they may have a response to the system, even though what they are responding with they had in plans for many, many years, is not going to prevent us, nor is it going to prevent NATO as a whole to move forward. We don't think it is justified to deploy offensive missiles when we're deploying defensive systems that have nothing to do with Russia. But we're not going to change our policy because they are taking a stance that we don't find justified.
Next one. Let's give a chance also for the others, especially for the students first. And also I wanted to remind the youngsters that ambassadors were really impressed about the time, and it will be a chance to give informal questions as we Latvians love to do. But first I kindly ask you to take them from here. Next one.
Okay, hello, my name is Yevgeny. I'm also from Riga University. First of all, thank you for your part of the discussion. Well, I would like to lead the maybe questions to the east side of the globe. Basically, how would you comment on all these political changes that are taking place in the Northern Korea now? How it will affect the NATO, some kind of changes maybe, because Korea, Southern Korea is reacting and it's basically an ally of US. And the second part of the question would be how you comment on the growing Chinese economic and military capabilities, basically taking a look back on the photos that were taken of the warship, the Chinese warship basically, in the sea.
I'm not sure what you're referring to in the photos of the Chinese warship.
Yeah, well, it was an information in our media that the photos were taken of the Chinese big warship in somewhere near the coast of China, basically.
At first, in terms of Korea, we are, given that this is such a closed society, change is always difficult to find out what is exactly happening. So we are observing the situation closely. I don't see any direct link to NATO directly, although who knows? The United States, of course, has troops in South Korea. We have troops in Japan. We, as a result, are by definition observing the situation very closely, but there's no reason to believe that anything massive is going to change in anytime soon in this part of the world. We just don't really know. The last time there was a transition, we faced a period of uncertainty, but the transition continued and led to the continuation of policy there, and we'll have to wait and see what happens in this particular case. There is a designated successor, and we'll figure out how that evolves over time. So it's it's an uncertain situation that everyone is watching closely. With respect just in East Asia in general, the fact that China is growing is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. A growing Chinese economy means that the people in China are going to be able to develop, to prosper, and that's to everybody's benefit. It is a very big country that used to be and still has large groups of people that are poor, and a growing economy will be able to take care and better care of the citizens of that country, and that's nothing for us to fear. In fact, that's something for us to welcome. As China grows, it will also expand its military capability. We're not particularly worried about that. What we want to make sure is that when an economy grows and the country grows, it does so in a way as a responsible actor in the international community. And China is, as a member of the Security Council, is a responsible actor. And we wanted to continue to be a responsible actor in that community. So we don't look at the enhancement and change in power necessarily as something bad or to be feared. We look at it as something that can benefit the people of China, can benefit the people of the region, and what is most important is that as countries develop and they grow in importance and have a greater role in the international community, that they play that role in a way that is responsible as responsible international citizens, which China up to this point has done, and there's no reason to believe that won't continue.
So we have time for the last question, and if there is one. Yeah, well, Voldemars is waiting for a very long time, and youngsters don't have apparently.
Let me switch from the very important international topics to some internal issues dealing with Americans themselves. I find, and I am now reading a book, Barack Obama book, Dreams from My Father, and I found it as very interesting and openly written book testimony, let's say, and the title is Erase and Inheritance. And my question is how you will evaluate changes during the Obama administration in bringing closer and closer American people belonging to different races. Maybe, let's say, some white Anglo-Saxon fundamentalists from southern states have another opinions options in their minds. Thank you.
Well, one of the strengths of the United States, although of course it's had its problems over its history, but one of its strengths of the United States is that in the United States you're first and all an American, and then you're something else. And you may be a Catholic or a Jew or something else, or you may be black or white or yellow, but you're first and all an American. And the way I look at the United States as somebody born in the Netherlands, and I'm American. I can be as American as anybody, except I can't be president of the United States unless they change the Constitution. But other than that, I can do whatever other American can do. And the way I look at Barack Obama's presidency, he was the 44th man, in this case they're all men, to be elected president of the United States. And that's all that matters. He is the president of the United States. He's an American. He is acting as all presidents before him, and I am sure all presidents after him, in the best interest of the country. And the question of what happens to race relations and political relations is an important one, and one that perhaps over dinner one day and a couple of glasses of wine we can discuss in detail. But as the American ambassador to NATO, all that matters to me is that we have an American president. And it doesn't really matter that he is the first African-American president. It matters as me as an American, but not as the American ambassador. The way to look at this is part of the American story. And that story is written every day. It will continue to be written, just as the Latvian story is written every day, and it will continue to evolve. And hopefully it will evolve in a way that is as supportive for unity of a country and strength of the country here in Latvia as it is in the United States. As someone who, of course, supported the President Obama before he became president, I think he's a great president for this country and for our times. But I also know that there are lots of Americans who disagree with that. And one of the great things about our country is we can disagree about it, and we can resolve those differences at the ballot box rather than in any other way, which is what brings all of our societies in NATO together. It's one of the great strengths of this country, and it's one of the great strengths of all countries, including NATO.
So probably we have to stop at this point, as we should squeeze this discussion into Ambassador's schedule, as he has other commitments still. Before closing this session, I would like to say thank you to Ambassador for opening the discussion round that will last till the next year, December, every month. So I kindly ask you all to follow the news and social media, also what's happening in and with NATO, and also with the experts here with us. I will stop here. I will invite you all to the coffee break and to some more informal discussions. Latvians love informal questions. Sometimes they are even more challenging and interesting than those from the discussion hall. And I would kindly ask you all to devote a round of applause to our Ambassador and say thank you.
What do you do?
They're conditioned to the Cold War. It's very close. So I think it's very helpful for the students. I don't think any ambassador for any